Hey guys, it's Sam, and today I'm going to talk about books you should read if you enjoyed Netflix's Shadow and Bone. This also obviously applies if you've read the Shadow and Bone trilogy as well as the Six of Crows duology and are looking for books with a similar feel. So let's get into it and start first with the Shadow and Bone trilogy elements of the story. My first and forever recommendation is the Winter Night trilogy by Katherine Arden. I consider this sort of a grown-up and, dare I say, like better, more evolved, more complex version of the Grisha trilogy. If you liked that, or you liked elements of that but wanted more of an adult version of that, I would say this is your series. This is an adult fantasy series that takes place in historical Eastern Europe and Russia and follows some of the historical events of that time, but also weaves in a lot of magic as well. Our main character is a girl who really is one foot in the magical world and one foot in the real world, and we follow her throughout her entire life. So we first see her as a kid up through like teenager, I want to say, and then we follow her as an adult. And she also has a very compelling and interesting dynamic with a god of death. So if you enjoyed the Russian Eastern European inspired mythos of the Grisha trilogy, if you enjoyed the dynamic with the Darkling but want something where it's like, yeah, not really like a villain, but maybe like questionable, interesting magic, things like that, although the magic in here is not really similar to the Grisha magic. But if you want some of those elements in an adult series, this is for you. In a similar vein, we have Uprooted by Naomi Novik. This is a standalone adult fantasy, and this is again good for if you liked the Eastern European setting and the dynamic with the Darkling. Again, not a villain in this case. Both of these I wouldn't say are those kinds of, it's not a villain main character romance or anything like that, but if you like some of the elements and wanted it not to be with a literal bad guy, this is going to be more your jam. This follows a main character who lives in this village, and each handful of years, I forget how long, between one of the women in the village is chosen and given to the dragon. The dragon is not actually a dragon, it is a magician, like basically immortal magician, and she is obviously chosen unexpectedly, and everything kind of goes from there. It's also surrounded by magical woods, so if you're into the magical woods trope like I am, some recommendations on the screen for that trope if you would like more. I think this is also a really good stepping stone between YA and adult if you are trying to get a little bit out of YA and go more into adult. This is definitely an adult book, but it is a very good bridge book between the two age categories of books. Lastly, for this kind of category of Eastern European inspired fantasy, we have Deathless by Catherine N. Valente. This one is probably the most like morally gray of all the stories and the most complicated. It's also an adult fantasy standalone. If you're at all used to Valente's writing, it's a little bit odd and it's kind of hit or miss for people. So people either love her books or hate her books. But this one is where our main character marries the god of life, who is really almost more like a god of death. It's all very like complicated. If you're at all familiar with Eastern European folklore, it's like very different from other fairy tales and folklores that you might be used to if you're used to more like traditional Western European type stuff. But this has all of those Eastern European folklore elements, very dark. If you're into the Darkling and Alina as a like full couple and wish that happened, this is probably gonna be more your jam. These two are like kind of toxic, actually. The writing in here, super good. And it's one of the stories that sticks with you. When I first read this book, I was like, maybe like a 3, but I think about lines from this book all the time. But I would say this is slightly harder than the other two to get into. I would say that if you're not super used to, again, this is almost like a combination of like literary with fantasy in the way that Valente writes. So I would say give it a go. Try it out, especially if you want a little bit of toxicity in your romance. This is definitely a book that doesn't condone the toxicity either, so if you're like, oh, I don't really like that, it's not saying it's good. The narrative very much points out that this is not a good thing. Next we get into the category of books that just gave me a similar vibe to the Grisha trilogy after I read it. Whether it was a similar like sort of chosen one kind of trope, the magic, the like kind of band that we get to see kind of form throughout of like the extended cast and things while still being largely a first person POV. That's this range of books. It's more feeling, but I think you guys will get it. It's slightly hard to articulate why sometimes I feel like these books fall in a similar category to the Grisha trilogy, but they do. Just believe me. First is the Girl of Fire and Thorn series by Ray Carson. This came out around the same time as the Grisha trilogy, so if you are just into that like slightly older YA and you just kind of want that and are feeling very nostalgic for it, I would say give this one a go. It's a very underrated series. I barely hear anyone talk about it. This follows the main character who is actually plus size and takes place in a, I would say like Latinx inspired, I don't know if it's technically like Spanish or like Latin American like setting wise, but very much like everyone is Hispanic descent, even though it's a fantasy world. It's not our world at all. That adds some interesting like cultural elements that are taken from those cultures and like the architecture and the religion and things like that. But we have a very similar kind of feel of traveling around this world, having sort of like a cast of like side characters that we get introduced to through our main character, having an interesting magic and some similar like plot threads. And this romance is much more of a like slow burn, like you don't even really know what the romance is going to be until like the second book, and with a character who's like very good. So I would say if you want like a combination Nikolai Mall without the Nikolai like humor, because I wouldn't say that the love interest is like that. If you're more into those romances from the Grisha trilogy, then I would say this is probably more your jam. Next we have the Imperium trilogy by Claire Legrand. I still have not read the last book, but I plan to soon. But this again is just similar vibes. I think mostly this gives me a similar feeling because of Alina in general, and just the fact that we like follow Alina in the Grisha trilogy. These two main characters are actually separated by like 1,000 years, but their stories intertwine, and they both have like magical abilities that are largely elemental. So we do have this like idea, like sort of like the Grisha with like these elemental powers. And I would say that the dynamic between the villain and the main characters in here is very interesting. So if you, again, dig the Darkling Alina dynamic, not necessarily romance dynamic, then you'll probably enjoy this. This also has an element, at least in the second book, of like trying to find magical items similar to having to find the amplifiers in the Grisha trilogy. So again, there's some similarities there that if you like some of those elements, you'll probably like this. Then we have the Witchland series by Susan Dennard. This is a series that is currently ongoing, and honestly, my probably favorite YA fantasy series is currently ongoing. This is a little bit more like older YA, I would say. I think all the characters are like maybe 18 latest. I think they're more like 19, 20, 21, 22, honestly. So it's almost like new adult, but it's categorized as YA. This is a YA fantasy series. Again, we're following characters with multiple different kinds of powers and different types. So if you are into the Grisha ranking and like different, you know, sort of what kind of Grisha are you, same kind of thing with the Witchlands and like what kind of like Witchlander would you be, that kind of element. Again, we follow a lot of characters, so it's multiple POV. So instead of just following one character, we get multiple point of view. And that's sort of where the similarities end, but I would say that if you liked stuff about the Grisha verse in general, I think you would like this. And this has a lot more going on and is really super intricate. And again, one of my favorite series that's currently ongoing in YA. I love what Susan Dennard is doing. I trust her with my whole heart. And lastly is We Hunt the Flame by Hafsa Faisal. This is the last part for the Grisha stuff. I'm gonna give you some little bonus recommendations as well. But this one, I don't have much to like say about why, but when I read this, I just felt like it was very similar to the Grisha feelings for me. You might not get a similar feeling, but when I was reading it, my feelings were similar, which is why it's on the list. Can I exactly pinpoint why? Not really, because it is a very different story. This is set in like a Middle Eastern inspired world from what I remember, because it's been a little while since I've read it. And they're going on to, the two characters that we follow are sort of going on a quest for a magical item. So we have that, and then we have, you know, our main characters that we're focusing on and other side characters again. So it feels very much like some of the feelings that you get in Siege and Storm, and especially Ruin and Rising, and like the people sort of around Alina. So I definitely recommend this one for just like similar vibes. Now I have some bonuses for the Six of Crows stuff. So if you, again, watched the show or read the books and liked the Six of Crows elements with Kaz and Inej and Jesper, then here are two little bonus recommendations for that. The first one is actually one that gets comped to Six of Crows a lot, but is different, but is in a similar genre because they're all sort of like heist stories with multiple POVs. That's a very popular trope, in case you guys didn't know that. And that is The Gilded Wolves by Rashi Chakshi. This is taking place in 1889 Paris, but there are like magical societies. Our crew of teenagers are trying to hunt for this like magical artifact. It's all very tied with like, there's like Egyptian myth and all these other things. And if you were into like powerful houses and all of that, and it's also incredibly diverse the same way as Six of Crows. Crows. So we have all these different POVs that we are following of all these teenagers who are bringing different skills to the table, bringing different backgrounds to the table, their different dynamics with each other. Again, if you liked how the Crows have that dynamic, their dynamic here is something similar to sink your teeth into. And lastly, for an adult recommendation for that like heisty thieves crew sort of story, we had the Gentleman Bastard series by Scott Lynch, the first one being The Lives of Locke Lamora. This is an adult fantasy series and very tonally different from the YA series following teenagers. These are adults. Although we do start following Locke when he's like a little bit younger, like you get flashbacks to him like becoming the master thief that he is. But Locke, and especially his best friend Jean, are perfect, and they are in this crew, and so you get to see like all their shenanigans. This is like a calmer, more developed version of Kaz from Six of Crows. Like if you thought Kaz was like a mastermind, you have not met Locke. Okay, like the things that this man does, his brain, and the fact that he's actually like not a fighter at all, he just is like master thief. He's great. I will say there are less women in this series. They are in here, but in the crew, you don't get women until the third book, which I have yet to read, so I can't really comment. People have very polarizing opinions on that. So if you're okay, these guys are like two bros kind of in love. Like they're not gay, but like there's a bromance that is very serious. So if you want some like genuine men platonically loving each other, which is so pure and you rarely see in books and media and stuff, recommend giving this a go. And again, some master level heists and conniving and thieving. It's fantastic. So that is it for the books I recommend if you enjoyed the Grishaverse, Six of Crows, the Shadow and Bone series, and the Shadow and Bone Netflix series. So comment down below, let me know if there's any books that you would also recommend for this category of book and media. Thank you all for watching. I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.